this video is about designing good enough. In web design, you cannot get pixel perfection, and that trips a lot of designers up when they try to design for web. They design something that looks perfect on the page, hand it over to a developer or try to code it themselves, and the design just falls apart. So the idea of design in web design is that you get it looking good, but you also have a lot of fallback plans in case something goes wrong. There are differences in designing for print and designing for web if you are used to designing for print. Firstly, the size and the output are different. Colors end up being different. Fonts, the technology used, and the different usage by the end users, of course. So let's look at the size and output first. With print, you have fixed sizes usually, something like A4, A5 if you're in Australia. You usually know exactly how many pages you're going to print, and usually that creates a limitation around what you are able to put in the design. How much space is available on those pages? And there you also have choices in stock. You can decide on what the texture of the paper will be, what the weight of the paper will be. And if you want to be really fancy, you can use die cutting to change the shape of the prints. Now, the other thing you have to consider in print design is bleed and safety areas, so that you're not printing something and then it gets chopped off when the design is cropped. Now contrast that with designing for the web. Your device sizes dictate how big the design is going to be. So instead of A4 or A5, your user will have different device sizes, and they vary enormously. There are, in theory, unlimited page length and pages, and it doesn't really cost you extra to make an infinite scrolling web page rather than a short web page, so you have a lot more freedom with your space. Unfortunately, you have no stock choices, so even though we have touch screens which are tactile, they can feel the surface, you have no control over that whatsoever. The thing to remember is there a particular target device? Are you designing for smartwatches? Are you designing for smart fridges? Will most of your users be using a mobile device to access your website? The shape is always going to be that of the device, so you can't have fancy die cuts, of course. And the other thing to consider is that the browser itself can usually be resized. So even if it loads at a particular size, if they're on a computer, they can resize that browser and make it smaller or larger. Colors are different in print to the web. So in print, you're looking at CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, plus any spot colours you might want that would be brighter than what's available by mixing CMYK. You have a limited gamut, so if you have a look at the diagram on this page, you can see that the CMYK only encompasses a small amount of the visible colours that are available to the human eye. It's not as bright and as clear as RGB, and a lot of the colour quality depends on the stock and the printing quality. So here's an example. On the left we have an image which would be the full RGB. On the right, this is what it would look like if you were to print it in CMYK, and you can see that it loses a lot of that vibrancy. So contrast that to the web. In the web we use RGB, red, green and blue. The gamut is larger than CMYK, but still not as bright as real life. The output colours are largely dependent on the device, and there is no guarantee of the brightness and the contrast of your particular end user's device. And some devices don't even have colour, so you have to consider, well, how is this design going to look if someone is viewing it in grayscale? Now we look at the fonts. So in print, It uses the system fonts, whatever is on your computer, needs to be installed on your computer, and you need to have license to use the font in your design. You can embed the files into, embed the font files into the files to send to your printer. And the size of the font in the end and the weight is all going to be determined by the designer. Once it's printed, that's it. That's what it stays at. And it should stay the same on the design output as what the designer intended. The text layout when it comes to print is very tightly controlled so that you don't have things like widows and orphans ruining the flow of the type. So you need to consider widows and orphans. So here's an example of what that looks like, the widows and the orphans, and why we do not want that in design. Now with the web, on the other hand, you need to use web fonts or web safe system fonts. You can't just use any font that's on your computer. That limits your choices unless you are paying to use a particular font. You need to have license to use the fonts if you are using, at FontFace font kits. Font stacks can provide different options. So if the web font doesn't work for some reason, you have some fallbacks. There's no guarantee that any of your fonts will work, though they should. If you use a reliable web font and some web safe system fonts as the fallback, then you at least have some control over the final design. The font size is actually dependent on the user. They can make it larger or smaller as they need. And as a result, the text layout can change depending on the device size, the browser size, the font size. If the user resizes the browser, resizes the font, it's going to completely change your text layout. So you don't have the fine control of preventing your widows and orphans, unfortunately. Now, when it comes to the technology for print, you always need to keep on top of the latest in print technology to give the best possible outcome for your client. Stock changes as well. So what stock is available for the job? What printing techniques are available? Because they also change over time. When it comes to the web, what is technically possible? Are you asking the impossible? Is your client asking the impossible, or can it be done? And even if it is possible, what is technically feasible? So yes, maybe the client's great idea could be done, but it will cost an absolute arm and a leg. So maybe that is not what they want. What most devices and browsers support. So there may be new technology out, but if most browsers can't actually view it, then it's not much use to you. Which devices and browsers do your audience use? Sometimes that can influence how you design, especially when it comes to older browsers that you still have to support, even though there's some great new features that they won't be able to use. Difference in the end usage by the end users. So print is a linear experience. Usually they will read a brochure, a book, or read a poster from top to bottom, left to right, start to finish. It's delivered as is, exactly as it's designed. It encourages the audience to read further, to read to the end, and to read everything. Ideally, that's what you want people to do with print design. Now, print design supports different textures and different physical interactions as people turn the page. They can feel the paper, feel the stock, feel the cover. With web, it's different. It's an omnidirectional experience. Very rarely will someone read a website all the way through, from start to finish, top to bottom, left to right. You need to get the audience to explore, to click through links. That's our goal when it comes to web design. The idea being to encourage interaction and immersion. Rather than reading the whole thing, we want them to visit more pages, stay for more time. Now, the great thing about the web is it supports digital interactivity and animation. While you don't get that tactile experience, you can get a completely interactive experience as it responds to whatever you do as a user. So, how do you design for web if you are, by nature, a print designer? Think about your content first. What needs to be delivered, how much needs to be on each page, and how will the users navigate between these pages. The other thing is always think of mobile first, because people access the web more often using a mobile device now than a computer screen. So how will your website appear on a small device? Will there be the same content on all devices? How will it progressively change for different device sizes? And what happens if someone has a non-typical device or browser size? What happens to the design then? With colour, make sure you use RGB. Use colour to enhance the design, but don't use it as the absolute crux of your design working, because sometimes the colours aren't going to appear the same. You might end up on a device that is only monochromatic. You can use colour, for instance, to demonstrate information hierarchy, to attract attention, but you really do need to remember that colour doesn't always work. So always use a second method for your information hierarchy, for attracting attention, for indicating what interactions are possible. When it comes to fonts, choose a reliable web font and ensure you have license to use it. Use graceful degradation. So even if you have used a reliable web font and added it to your CSS, make sure you always use a font stack so that there are fallback fonts if something happens to your web font. Use common system fonts in the font stack. Make sure you use fonts that are available on PC and Mac. If you have, for instance, only the Mac system fonts there, then PC users aren't going to have much of a user experience on your site. The font must be readable on all devices, so be aware of that when you're choosing display fonts, for instance. And the font must be large enough to read, very important on mobile devices. So remember that for mobile devices, your line length should be 30 to 40 characters long, whereas for a computer screen, you can afford to have 50 to 60 characters long. With your layout, make sure you use responsive or adaptive design so that the design changes for mobile devices. It's very, very difficult to navigate and read a website that's intended for computer on a very small mobile device screen. Make sure there's no side scrolling, so where people have to move the screen sideways to see all of the content on the page. People on mobile devices are very happy to scroll down the page though. Make sure that for small devices your layout has wide columns, because narrow columns mean incredibly short line length and or very small fonts. And then progressively enhance your design as devices get larger so that you can afford to have, one column changing to 2 columns, for instance, and then for larger devices again it becomes 3 columns or 4 columns and so on. When it comes to your media, make sure it is small enough to load quickly. Balance that with ensuring it is high quality enough for the purpose it is intended. Remember, you are limited with the types of files that will work in a browser, so JPEGs, PNGs, SVGs, MP4s and MP3s, also GIFs or GIFs depending on your pronunciation. Then make sure you design with flexibility in mind. Design for different layouts and for different sizes. Graceful degradation of fonts. Don't rely on colour as the only solution for design problems. And make sure that your website has considered usability and readability first. They're the most important things even before you get into the visual design.